Genesis 12, 10 to 20, page 17. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. Then they'll kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I'll be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants, maidservants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. This is the word of the Lord. Sometimes I scratch my heads about the passages I pick, and you kind of wonder, why am I working through this book like this? But let me tell you, as we begin this sermon, that I think this is a suitable finishing point for the series we've done on Genesis as we've thought about our worldview. And I want to begin by introducing you to another great theologian. Can you remember the Australian theologian I introduced you to last week? It was Paul Kelly, wasn't it? So I want to introduce you to Rowan Atkinson. Everyone knows who Rowan Atkinson is. He's most famous for which character? Mr. Bean. And his slapstick comedy is terrific. Our family certainly enjoys it. But I suspect that his greatest contribution to Western culture is Blackadder. Now, I don't know if you've seen Blackadder, but the Blackadder series are brilliant. In fact, they are so good that at my school, it was compulsory for 3-unit history to watch his series on World War I. And if you ever watch the last of those series, I hope you'll be like me and burst into tears. Not out of laughter, but out of sorrow, because there are few better portrayals of the slaughter of World War I. But right throughout the Blackadder series, Rowan Atkinson has a sidekick, doesn't he? What's his name? Baldrick. I love Baldrick because he's very similar to me. Slightly thick, he's naive, as my mum likes to say, gormless. And he's the perfect foil for all of Blackadder's witty comments, isn't he? And in the trenches of World War I, faced by all those disasters and problems, as Blackadder is making cutting comments, Baldrick will pipe up with a line, won't he? What's his line constantly? I have a cunning plan. It's a great line, isn't it? Because he always does have a cunning plan, and they always fail spectacularly. They're foolish, they're ludicrous, they fly in the face of reality. It's a running joke right throughout the series. I think the reason Baldrick has cunning plans is because he wants to be in control. Does he sound familiar? It's pretty similar to Bernard Gabbett this last week, I suspect, and maybe like you. All of us have cunning plans, don't we? And I suspect many of us have cunning plans because we actually want to feel in control in a world, as we learned last week, which seems so bleak and out of control. And today we meet a bloke who's got a cunning plan, don't we? And it is a cunning plan. It's an attempt to bring some control to chaos. It's an attempt to make sense of a world that seems to be failing dismally. And like my cunning plans, the result is disastrous. So how about I pray and let's look at a cunning plan together. Dear God, thanks for your word. Help us never to tire of opening it, of hearing you speak personally to us by your Spirit, and to be a people who delight in what we read in your revelation. Father, apply it to our lives so that we are a people who delight in your plan alone. Amen. I'm at point 2 on the outline. Now there was a famine in the land, verse 10, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. We've got a drought. It's not a famine yet. But when you're in a subsistence economy and you have a drought, you get a famine, don't you? When what you plant is what you are going to eat and it hasn't rained for years, you have a food shortage. And do you notice what kind of famine it is there in verse 10? It's a severe famine. Not a run-of-the-mill famine, but it's a severe famine. And did you notice where it takes place there in verse 10? It's in the land, isn't it? That's a significant little phrase because over in verse 7 of Genesis 12, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I'll give this land." If you remember what we learned last week, the famine in the land is not just a lack of food for Abram, but is actually a moment of global significance. God's made promises to this bloke, hasn't he? We heard some of them as Mary was talking with the kids. He's taken this bloke and he said, "Through you, Abram, I'm going to create a great big family. And through that family, I'm going to give you a name that's renowned. And through that family placed in a land I'm going to show you, I'm going to roll back the curse of sin in the world, aren't I? I'm going to bring blessing and not brokenness to the world." God's doing that because there's a problem in the world, isn't there? This week, on Thursday, I took 2 funerals, back to back. On days like that, you can't avoid the brokenness of the world, can you? But we know that brokenness, don't we? That the world is damaged because humans have the attitude and action that says, "I am God and God's not." Where we've said that God, my cunning plan for the world is going to be better than your design. And the world is broken. It's under judgment. All human life ends in death. Now that didn't surprise God. It didn't catch God unawares. God's always had the same plan for his creation, that his people will live with him in blessing, approved by him, ruled by his word. And humans rebelling against him, not going to muck that up. God's always planned for that moment, and he's committed to his world so that he can roll back sin. And you'll remember that there's a pattern, a cycle there in Genesis where God creates or brings something good and humans sin and God judges, and then in his mercy he shows them gives them what they don't deserve, and the cycle continues. And remember last week we hit the bleakness of those genealogies where human life is about waking up and living and then dying. And then God intervened and showed his mercy by saying to Abram, "Abram, listen to me." Well, what was Abram doing at that moment? Can anyone remember? He was running away from God, wasn't he? He was worshipping anything but God. At the very moment where Abram is living in active rebellion against God, God says, "Abram, through your mob, I'm going to roll back the curse in the world." That's an example of God's grace, isn't it? That God gives humans what they don't deserve at the moment they deserve something else. So God works through that family. I think it's worth pausing at that point and remembering what we've learned about the character of God through Genesis. God is always gracious. God is always just and fair, and God always does what he says. He's gracious because he keeps giving humans what they don't deserve. He's always fair and just because he confronts sin with what it deserves. And he always does what he says. That's the picture we've had of God, isn't it? Throughout Genesis 1 to 12. And Abram, remember last week, responded with faithful obedience. He took God at his word and then he acted like it. But when he got to the land, remember we noticed that there were some significant problems. How old was Abram? He was 75. Not many people have their first child at 75. How many children did he have? None, because his wife's barren. And when he gets to the land in Genesis 12 verse 6, what does he find? Well, someone's made a prior offer and it's already occupied. They're significant problems, aren't they? Age, barrenness, a land that's promised but it's occupied. And what have we got now? A severe famine. It's no surprise then, is it, that Abram decides to move to Egypt. As you look down the road and you see the Nile Delta and it's green and there's water, it's a logical plan, isn't it? When you're experiencing famine. It's a natural response. It's a response that many other people have made in their time, but that doesn't make it the right response, does it? He's journeyed over 800 miles. He's come to the land that God's promised. He's trusted God by building altars and talking to God publicly. And yet at this point, when famine comes to the land, did you notice who is not mentioned? Did you notice who's absent in verses 10 to 16? Do you notice who Abram doesn't talk to? He doesn't talk to God, does he? He's got the promises of God, and now he takes matters into his own hands because, like you and me, his cunning plan is going to be more successful than God's promises, isn't it? In fact, God, let me give you a hand making your promises come true. I'll take the initiative, God. Does that sound familiar? It's worth pausing at that point, isn't it? And remembering what we've learned, not just about the character of God in Genesis 1 to 12, but the nature of humans. Humans who are so naturally sinful now that when they look at the world, the only person they see is I. Humans who say in their attitude and action, God, leave it to me because I can do a better job. Humans who are sinners because we think our cunning plans are better than the promises of God. But just there echoing in the background is an alternative, isn't there? The alternative that sees the grace of God and says, I'll take him at his word. I'll be faithfully obedient. Well, as he was about to enter Egypt, about point 3 on the outline, verse 11, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. Then they'll kill me, but let you live. Say you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life will be spared because of you. He's a shrewd bloke. You don't survive in the Middle East without knowing the facts of life, do you? He knows the way the world works. Remember, he's left all of his support network at home, 800 miles away. As he prepares to move into Egypt, he knows the way people work. So he pulls his wife aside and he lays out a cunning plan, doesn't he? Say you're my sister. That's a cunning plan for a number of reasons. Firstly, she really was his sister, at least his half-sister. So it's only a half lie, isn't it? Same father, different mother. It's a cunning plan because he recognises reality. He's moving to a foreign country with none of the hardware to back him up. He's got to be shrewd to get through this, doesn't he? And he recognises the local tradition and custom that you had to deal with a brother when it came to a sister if the parents were dead. So he's buying himself time, isn't he? Because he knows they're going to have to go through him if they want to get to Sarah. He's a cunning man. It's a shrewd plan. It's logical, it's sensible, it's going to buy him time, he's going to stay alive. On all worldly levels, you can't fault him, can you? But do you notice who's missing from his deliberations? And not just God. Do you notice that he plays fast and loose with a whole lot of areas to do with truth? Do you notice that he hasn't factored in one person? Look at verse 14. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants, maid servants and camels. You see, Pharaoh doesn't negotiate, does he? He just takes. That's what pharaohs do. He hasn't bought himself any time. Pharaoh's just stepped in and said, that's mine. Now, on face value, it doesn't seem too bad a thing, does it? On any worldly level, any natural level, things have gone well. He's still breathing. She's still breathing. And look at his Swiss bank account. It's gone through the roof, hasn't it? He's kept his head. His life is enriched and things go well. But let me tell you, it's not good. It's a disaster. Do you think Abram was treated well because Pharaoh was a nice man? Let me tell you that I think Pharaoh has paid a bride price, a dowry. That's why he's rich. So now Sarai is Pharaoh's wife. And what do husbands do with wives? They sleep together, don't they? It's a disaster on every level. Abram's wife has been taken. She's been forced into an adulterous situation, and those goods are a stain on his reputation. But it's deeper than that, isn't it? Because when you dig into the context, the background tells you how disastrous it is. What's the background? Abram, through your family, I will bring a great nation that will bless the world. Now, if you measure the success of this cunning plan against that context, it's a disaster. Abram is not in the land. Abram has no wife. Abram's wife is sleeping with another man, so that any descendants at that point will be of questionable origin, and God has been completely ignored. It's a cunning plan, isn't it? It's a disaster. It's gone remarkably badly. But let me tell you, that's what happens when you take a cunning plan over the promises of God. When you say, God, your plans will work better in my hands. When simple obedience and trust is not enough. I think it's worth pausing at that point and seeing another part of our worldview, isn't it? Remember, we've been reminded of the character of God and the nature of humans. We're reminded of the nature of sin here, aren't we? Who's in the centre of sin? I am. I'm God and God's not. And sin can seem so normal, can't it? So desirable, so clever, so wise. Do you remember back to the Garden of Eden where the snake laid it out before Eve? Hey, Eve, it's pleasant. It'll taste good. It is sensible. It is accessible. It is desirable. It is logical. And she reaches out and she eats. That's the nature of sin. It seems so sensible sometimes, doesn't it? But it flies in the face of what God has made clear, what experience so often makes obvious. The Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything she had. But the Lord. Isn't it good that God steps in? It's the same pattern throughout this part of Genesis. And when God steps in, the intervention is the right mix of justice and mercy. Do you notice the justice there? Pharaoh's sin is not excused, even though he did it unwittingly. He's still judged. There's judgment on Abram. Isn't it terrible when the world that doesn't follow God exposes people who do? When Pharaoh's behaviour lights up Abram's sin? You see, his bank account has improved, hasn't it? But his character is morally bankrupt. Isn't it so confronting when a Pharaoh exposes an Abram? But there's also mercy here, isn't there, from God? God is well within his rights to wipe everyone out, isn't he? And yet he does it in such a way that Pharaoh is spared, he's warned, but his family and his own life is spared. Notice how Pharaoh responds appropriately. Notice that Abram is rebuked and exposed, but his wife is returned, his life is spared, and he gets to keep his ill-gotten gains. It's only at the intervention of God that things turn. Abram hadn't consulted him. Abram hadn't trusted him. Abram hadn't considered him. And yet what does God do? He steps in and intervenes. Isn't that grace? Where God gives Abram what he doesn't deserve. And ultimately what happens? They go back to the land. So the things that Abram had compromised by his cunning plan are all put back in their right place by who? By God. Stepping in. Baldrick never seems to learn. It's one of the great delights about Blackadder. You know that when Baldrick pipes up, there's going to be something to laugh about. And on one level, it seems relatively harmless, doesn't it? Because it is only a television show. But on the other hand, isn't it a remarkable mirror into the human soul? I have a cunning plan. You see, if you know your Bibles well, you'll know that Abram does exactly the same thing in Genesis 20. Oh, what a fool. I mean, why didn't he learn his lesson? Does that sound familiar? You see, one of the great things about the heroes of the Bible is that they're humans like us. Abram is not fully formed in his remarkable trust in God. He is a human being like us who relies upon cunning plans. He's travelled 800 miles. He's left everything behind. He has made a public statement at altars with worship about who he trusts, and then a famine comes and he develops a cunning plan. Does that sound familiar? In fact, if you read the Bible from cover to cover, you could summarise the whole story of the Bible as a series of failed cunning plans, couldn't you? Time after time, what do humans do? Promise of God? God, leave it with me, I know better. Time after time, what happens to those plans? Well, they fail dismally. We want to be God instead of God, and time after time, verse 17 happens and God intervenes. We've got to recognise that the Bible then is an account of our human nature. We take matters into our own hands in the face of the certain promises of God, and the results are never good. Never good. God, you've promised this. I just don't think that's going to happen. I desire this. Let me take matters into my own hands. I have a cunning plan. I know better. But the great thing is that God remains faithful to his promises. And that's the wise thing, isn't it? That God remains faithful to his promises even in the face of our numerous cunning plans. But when you stand back and look at that whole history, let me just point out to you that there's one fella who stands out, isn't there? One bloke. We know who that bloke is. He never produces a cunning plan, does he? If you're familiar with the life of Jesus, you'll know that. As we were reminded of last week, he's descended from Abram. In fact, as we've been reminded a number of times, he's the culmination of everything promised to Abram, even promised back there to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15. He's the one that God says will come from Abram's family and chop the head off the snake. He's the one who'll live in a way that no human has ever lived, and he'll all do it by never taking matters into his own hands. If you're familiar with Jesus' life, you'll know how it begins and ends in his public ministry. What happens just after he's baptised? He goes into the desert, doesn't he? In fact, God takes him into the desert, and when he's in the desert, is it a retreat or a resort? Oh, it's a war, isn't it? Where the devil comes and says, Jesus, I've got a cunning plan. I want you to express that you're the Son of God by doing this. And every time, what does Jesus say? No. He refuses. He quotes the promise of God so that at the end of that, he's the only person we saw in Matthew's gospel who looks the devil in the eye and says, go away. At the end of his life, just as he's about to die, what's he doing? He's praying, isn't he? Just like he is at the start, he's on his own. Just like he is at the start, he's got a temptation. Snap your fingers and call up the legions of angels and show that you are the Son of God that way. What does he pray? My Father, your will and not my own. My Father, your plan and not my cunning plan. Isn't it good to have one bloke who doesn't have a cunning plan? Who goes, God, I take you at your word. I live in faithful obedience so that people like us can always have verse 17, but God. There's immense comfort there, isn't there? Because as you read your Bibles, as we read them together over the next few years from Genesis through to Revelation, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, the list goes on, the cunning plans that are created by humans that fail every single time, that bring consequences that are so hurtful and damaging. And every single time there's a verse 17, but God. You see, I think this is a great place to finish our Worldview Chiropractor series, isn't it? Because we're reminded of the character of God, aren't we? But God, the God who intervenes and gives us what we do not deserve. We're reminded of our own nature, aren't we? And our own history of cunning plans, our own desire to be God instead of God. We're reminded of the nature of the world that is littered with famine and with fullness, and we've got to navigate it. We're reminded time and time again that as God intervenes in our cunning plans, what's the appropriate response to his grace? It's faithful obedience, isn't it? And with that in mind, let me pray. Dear God, thank you for your word. Our Father, we often look at parts of Genesis and we lament the hero. Perhaps we've actually not recognised the true hero, Father. The fact that here it's not the man with the cunning plan, but it's the God who always does what he says. Father, that's the truth in our lives as we live day to day in a world that's broken, but in which you've sent your Son to chop off the head of the snake. Father, as we create our cunning plans, please bring us back to you. Please expose our sin. Please reveal your grace constantly to us. Bring us back to that one man who didn't have a cunning plan, but was faithfully obedient to you for our benefit. We pray this in his name. Amen. Any questions? You know who the first question's going to be from, don't you? Baxter. Go, mate. Yeah, it's a good question. So question Baxter asks is, why did he go to Egypt? Why didn't he go back home? I suspect he's just like me. Faced by 100 miles versus 800 miles, I'm going to go the 100-mile option. And that's really what he did. He was camped down the bottom there in the Negev desert, and he could look just across, if he's standing like me, to his left and see Egypt. So rather than travel all the way back up there, he went to Egypt, which was naturally pretty bountiful at that time. Does that answer your question? Terrific.